Good morning and welcome back to our Ask the Agronomist video series. I'm Kyla Watson here with Phil Long, once again a screen away. How you doing, Phil?
I'm doing pretty good. It's another warmer day and yeah, remotely once again, but we're all pushing for the same thing. So,
Right, exactly. We got some sunshine out there. Hard to complain on a beautiful week like this.
yeah, yep. I wish more more of this kind of weather for all of Latham country.
All right, very good. Well, today we have a topic that's very relevant to those farmers that are able to get out and in the field right now, and that is seeding depth in corn and soybeans.
Yeah, very timely topic as farmers are just starting to get their planters set up or maybe starting in the field, checking things over, things like that. So this is a good time to slow down and have a little reminder on the importance of seeding depth. And it seems like when you're at this point in the season, a lot of farmers have maybe a theory in mind that we've got ample moisture and it's going to be warmer in the top part of the soil, so maybe shallowing up planting depth is a good idea, and that's not the case. So
Mm-hmm.
that's something we want to make sure that we get across. No matter if it's April 15th or May 1st or whatever the case may be, when it comes to seeding depth, especially on corn, you want to make sure that it's at that 2-inch depth.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay, very good. And why is that so important? That talk a little bit about the root development, seed to soil contact.
Yeah, so the biggest thing with getting corn out of the ground, obviously, is to start that germination process we talked about last week, is that imbibitional phase. So
Mm-hmm.
to imbibe 30% of its weight in water, it's got to have good seed to soil contact. So, having obviously we don't want to have air pockets. So those closing wheels, we talk a lot about planter attachments and things like that. But getting good row closure and having that proper seeding depth allows that seed to be placed in a zone that's more ideal in terms of consistent moisture and really temperature. A lot of times that what I mentioned before, that thought process of, oh, it's closer to the soil surface, it's got to be warmer. That's not necessarily true. There's been quite a bit of research that shows that, within that 2-inch or that seeding zone, it's fairly similar, especially early in the season like this. Once you get really hotter temperatures, mid-May or late May, then it starts to deviate a little bit more, and it is hotter towards the very surface. But that's where the other part of this comes into play. So, it's important to be in that zone of adequate moisture and consistent moisture so that you get consistent emergence. That's ideal for optimal yield and so forth. But then the second part of that is where the nodal roots start to develop, where that crown is established within that plant. So when you plant a seed of corn at 2 inches at the optimal seeding depth, it's gonna first of all, it's gonna throw out, the first thing that comes out is the radicle, so that first root. And then the mesocotyl is going to grow upwards. It knows how to do this because of gravity, it can sense that. So it's going to grow upwards, and then it's going to establish those nodal roots. So once it hits the soil surface and starts to emerge, that first VE emergence phase, it's going to figure out where it's establishing that nodal root system. And it wants to put it at about 3/4 of an inch below the soil line. If we're pushing that seeding depth and we're pushing it up and shallowing it up, then what's going to happen is that mesocotyl is going to be scrunched together, and it's going to force those nodal roots to be closer to the soil surface.
Mm-hmm.
So not a good thing because what tends to happen then is they're developed into drier soil conditions. So that's something that you don't want to see if you end up in, we talk about this about every year, it seems like a little bit, but rootless corn, floppy corn syndrome early in the season because those nodal roots established in dry soil conditions and then they died off basically. So they weren't able to establish a good healthy root system and so they fell over. The other thing that can happen is late in the season. So this may not seem like an issue. Maybe the corn comes up great, you think it's looking fine, but then later the season, maybe you could potentially have some lodging issues, root lodging issues, because that root system is compromised. It didn't start out well. It wasn't a healthy root system like it should have been, and so ultimately throughout the whole season, nutrient uptake and so forth was reduced. So yield is going to be reduced just because it didn't establish a good root system to take over for that plant. So seems like a lot of things coming together, but it really does. That's why we talk so much about how important it is at planting time to make sure that you're doing all the right things because that affects the rest of the season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good placement really does translate right into yield.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it just the other little thing that happens, and it's tough to. We'll post a picture up of this one, but when you shallow up seeding depth, a lot of times you think maybe, oh, it's closer to the soil surface, so logically it would come out sooner. It would emerge faster. Maybe that's your thought. You want to get it emerged as quickly as possible, but it actually delays emergence. It delays the plant's development. So you can tell, and there's actually been a lot of research done to show that it actually delays development. So a corn planted at the optimal 2-inch depth versus one planted at 3/4 of an inch or shallower, that shallow one is actually going to be behind in development. So something, all these things add up. And like we always talk about, you want corn to emerge within about 2 days of its neighboring plant. All those things really total up at the end of the season to give you that optimal yield that everybody's shooting for.
Right. Okay. Very good. So let's just talk real quick on the soybean side. So what would you say is the optimal seeding depth for soybeans?
Sure. So soybean seeding depth doesn't get talked about quite as much as corn, but it's still very important. I would say 1.5 inches is that depth to shoot for. When it comes to soybeans, a lot of times farmers will say maybe, you'll see delayed emergence or it can't emerge from, such and such a depth. I really don't worry about delayed or uneven emergence in soybeans until it gets pushed to over 2 inches. Soybeans can emerge from pretty deep depths. It'd surprise you easily, probably from 3, but it's going to be uneven. So keeping it around 2 inches or less for sure. That 1.5 inches is a good mark to shoot for on soybeans. So the other thing when it comes to soybeans is seed size. This gets talked about occasionally and brought up in conversation. How does that affect how the soybean emerges? So if you look at a soybean that's a larger seed size, the way to think of it is that larger seed, that seed that you see, those are the cotyledons. So once that plant starts pushing down its first root and then pushing those cotyledons and pulling them up through the soil, it's going to open up, and those are your first leaves, not the first true leaves, but those are the cotyledons. That's what gives the seed and that plant, until it gets its leaves out and gets out of the ground, gets its first true leaves out, that's what gives it all the resources. So the bigger the seed, ultimately the more resources it has. So technically, a bigger seed could be planted at a deeper depth. But the only caveat to that is you got to remember the smaller seed is less to pull through the soil. So it's less resistance, like pulling a basketball up through the soil versus a golf ball. It's a little easier for those to pull up. And when you're working in maybe a more crusted soil situation, if it rains really hard and you have to pull those cotyledons have to pull up through crust, then it's a challenge because those bigger seed sizes tend to have more issues. It could have a swollen hypocotyl or could break off those cotyledons, which is not what you want to see, and can lead to yield reduction. So just thinking about that, depending on your seed size and so forth, the ideal depth doesn't change. It's 1.5 inches. That's where you want to see it. Soybeans do imbibe about 50% of their weight in water, but they pull it up very quickly. And we talked about that last week, how quickly they can imbibe water and start that germination process. But staying with that 1.5 inches is best for soybeans.
Okay, sounds good. Is there anything else that you would like to add this morning?
No, I think that sums it up well. Hopefully farmers, I'm excited to see everybody in the field and seeds moving really quickly around here, but just take the time. Remember, check those important things like how well your seeding depth is and the closing wheels and so forth, everything on your planter. And then just also remember to slow down and be safe. I think this is the time of the year when we got to remember that with everything that's going on. It's important to come home at the end of the day and stay safe.
And enjoy it, right?
Exactly. It is days like this too. It's a wonderful part of the world and thing to be involved in. I mean, farming is definitely a huge blessing to be a part of.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, Phil, for joining us this morning, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Have a good day.